This is DBrief, brought to you by the Australian Industry Group.
Yes, indeed. Welcome to DBrief, your monthly briefing on industry policy and development in Australia and what it means for your business, especially in terms of the three critical aspects of today's changing world, the 3Ds. Digitalisation, what industry policy developments are underway to assist and enable the economy and your business to digitalise as fast as possible, to ensure we remain internationally competitive and locally effective. Decarbonisation, what industry policies are being put in place to ensure we achieve our national and our individual net zero carbon emission targets by no later than 2050. And diversification, the policy developments underway to ensure the economy and your business are no longer subject to single points of failure or unnecessary risks and disruptions. Hello, my name is James Scotland from the Australian Industry Group, and joining me to deliver this monthly briefing on the 3Ds is my co-host, an industry policy specialist and the head of industry policy and development for the Australian Industry Group, Louise McGrath. Hello, Louise.
Hi, James.
I tell you what, Louise, we've got a lot to talk about this month. In all of the 3Ds, actually, there's been progress with industry policy on cybersecurity and also modern-day slavery. The government has announced this month the Future Made in Australia as part of the decarbonisation of the Australian economy. And likewise, it also made an announcement about the net zero transition. So let's get into it. The Future Made announcement was announced by the Prime Minister, which means it's a big announcement. And some people have wondered if it's the Australian version of the US Inflation Reduction Act, while others have said it's a good step, but we need more. What's it all about, Louise? Is this a sort of like a big policy development for Australian industry and business, or is there more to come? Is it a complete policy or more like one instalment of a bigger program?
Well, it's certainly an announcement, and it's very big on announceables. It's very big on ambition, but very small on detail. So really, in the Prime Minister's announcement, he talked about programs that already exist. He gave a bit of extra money, I think, to the Climate Change Authority, but essentially the National Reconstruction Fund, $15 billion, that was captured under it, and, you know, a few of the other climate change related funding mechanisms as well. So no real change, just joining all the dots together to make it clear that these are part of one big package. It doesn't, well, it could replace the Inflation Reduction Act. The thing about the Inflation Reduction Act, there's very much a consumer element to it. So if you buy your electric vehicle, you get a tax rebate. That's not part of this. This is about lifting industry. And we'll expect to see a lot more detail in the budget. But our announcement, which we put in sort of as an Easter egg in the show notes of last month's podcast, because we didn't have a chance to talk about it, and then, you know, it was announced, so we made it there. So extra points for anyone who found it and read it. But we made the point that, you know, governments have a role of creating a framework, but they don't necessarily have a great role in manipulating the market, particularly in Australia. We're a small economy. And we can look at what happened with the automotive sector. And, you know, lots of opinions on whether that was good or bad as we were doing it and as it ended. You know, because, of course, when you give money to one sector, I mean, someone else is missing out. And we have less choices on what we can do with our funding when we make those sorts of choices. Future Made in Australia, it sounds great. It means that every manufacturer thinks, great, there's going to be money to support me. That's not going to be true, because that's just not the way the world works. There will be winners that are picked, that are priority sectors. Ideally, they probably will be in you know, assisting our transition to net zero, but it's really unclear. But have I ever given you, James, my theory on manufacturing in Australia?
No, please give me your theory on manufacturing in Australia. By the way, Future Made in Australia is a really good name.
It's great. It's a great election. It's a great election slogan, which perhaps is what it is.
Tell me about manufacturing.
So the word manufacturing, because, you know, I'm a linguist, means many things. So you could be manufacturing rockets, you can be manufacturing furniture, you can be manufacturing medicines. So we bandy it around, say all manufacturing is good.
You can manufacture food.
Exactly.
We do manufacture food.
beer.
Yeah,
I mean, there's all sorts of manufactured facts.
Of course we do.
So I like to think of Australian manufacturing as sort of three broad buckets. The first one being low tech, low skilled. So think about making a lot, commodity level manufacturing, fasteners, underpants, socks, low, mass commodity level where there's no competitive advantage. A whole lot of extruded plastics, a whole bunch of stuff where there's no very low. And so we import a lot of that stuff. And it's essential because you don't get to the next two stages without those sorts of inputs. Second stage would be mid-tech, mid-skills. So that's car assembly. Because I don't know if you've ever been to a car assembly plant, but it's like Lego. You're putting it together, but you're not really manufacturing anything. So without government support, that assembly. So without government support, we don't have a market size that can sustain that. And so without those subsidies, that industry moved offshore. But the things you really care about in your car, like the brake pads, still made in Australia. So those high-tech, high-skilled manufactured products. And they are the names of companies, like Cochlear, like ResMed, these sort of medical techs, really complex machinery. Anything that you put in or on your body, so skincare, food, etc., medicines, that does really well in the Australian context because it's got a niche market. It's got credibility. It has so much value add that it is competitive in the global markets. That's really what survives in Australian manufacturing. So what this future in manufacturing is, I don't know, because a lot of announcements on solar panels, which primarily at this point are at that assembly level, so that mid-tech, mid-skilled. So is that what we should be investing in? Well, it's not really my choice, but I suspect that really if we look at those companies that we hold up as champions, they're really in the high-tech, high-skilled sector.
Yeah, I went to the Cochlear assembly plant or the manufacturing plant in Brisbane, and they're incredibly fine manufacturing. The Cochlear implant does multiple, I think 7 or 8 different things in this very small thing that goes into your ear and you can't see. It's incredible. And as an Australian company, I think it was created in Perth, and now it's a global company from Australia. That's the stuff that you're saying is the future.
Yeah, and those sorts of manufacturers, rather than dying in Australia, their exports have doubled over the last 20-odd years. So they are, as I said, globally competitive. And it doesn't really matter how small our market is or how far away we are. Often these companies develop to have, footprint across the world, but they are where we can really compete. And anyway, that's my theory on manufacturing.
But that connects nicely with Future Made in Australia, because our AI Group's response to the announcement was, in part, quote, "The Prime Minister rightfully identifies cooperative partnerships between government, business and the community as necessary. The key to great and productive partnership lies in dividing the tasks involved between the partners to deliver them." In other words, he's sort of saying, or we're saying in the response, that we need to figure out who should be doing what.
Yeah, that's right. And whether should we be investing in sectors where other countries already have that competitive or comparative advantage? That's really the question. Anyway, so we'll see the budgets. Second week in May, Innes will be in the lockup, as will Jeff Wilson, who worked on our submission with me. And so we'll be doing a webinar, et cetera, after that, and member advice. But we'll be looking very carefully to see if there is extra money and where it's going and how it's being spent.
Yeah, the budget's going to be an interesting document, as it always is. And I look forward to talking to you about the process there a bit more later on. Let's talk about digitalisation. The homework you set for us this month was to read AI Group's cybersecurity report, a critical part of digitalisation. And you also asked us to read the submission to the new cybersecurity framework. In the AI Group submission to the federal government's consultation paper on the proposed quote, 2023 to 2030 Australian Cyber Security Strategy Legislative Reforms, AI Group made several recommendations to the proposed new cyber security legislation. As an overall statement, the response said, regulations should be designed in a way that is practical for widespread uptake amongst industry. It imposes least cost compliance burden and supports rather than inhibits confidence in broader digital upgrading by industry. Louise, isn't this self-evident? Why do we have to put an obvious comment in about try and make it least cost compliant and supports rather than inhibits confidence?
Well, the challenge is in all this regulation is balancing the need to allow businesses to do what they do, which is business, but also providing confidence and trust in the consumer sector. So consumers at the moment, with Optus, with Medibank, there's been a couple of big scares where consumers have been confronted with the fact that their own personal data is vulnerable to attack. So Optus had a big cyber attack, which meant that thousands of Australians' passports, driver's license, all those IDs were now on the black market and everyone had to get replaced, et cetera, et cetera. So that is quite shocking for those who are captured by it, and it's extra life admin, which drives everyone mad. But for many of our members, they don't have a business to consumer business model. They're business to business. So they're not holding the same level of data that a consumer facing business would. However, it's really difficult to create a regulation that says, well, if you've got private individuals as customers, you have to do this. And if you have businesses as customers, you have to do that. That's quite challenging. So it's really us putting into the government, try to find that easy balance where we're not stifling innovation and entrepreneurship, but we're also protecting consumer data and people's data. And
I was just going to say, one way we understand the whole issue is making sure everyone who's affected is reported so we can see what the issue is and how big it is and how big it's changing. But we need to do that in a way that's not going to put all of the burden on the companies who already got a problem with ransomware or whatever.
Yeah. So the ransomware reporting, it's a strange one because really the government admitted that the reason why they want this ransomware reporting is not that they're going to build a police force to go and protect companies, but just so they have an understanding of the scale of the problem. But when we ask, well, what is a ransomware? So, we had one of our members present on a webinar about their experience of ransomware where their computers were locked up. They had, I think it was 1 million Bitcoin or something. And all their machinery, which was also really embraced in digitalization, was also frozen. That is pretty clear ransomware. Pay the ransom and then we'll release your machines. But we had another member who had someone break in just to their printer. And so ordered the printer remotely to print out, pay, 1 million Bitcoin to such and such account, or we will attack you. And it just printed until it ran out of paper. Then that was it. They weren't actually in anything else other than the printers. So was that a ransomware attack? Because the efficacy wasn't that great. Yeah. So I don't want to judge the ransom attackers. And what we worry about is the government has said they don't care if you pay or not. Recommendation is not to pay. But sometimes insurance companies do put a bit of pressure on to pay because it reduces the business interruption insurance cost. However, we think that this is a thin edge of the wedge and eventually there will be some regulation on whether you can pay a ransomware. And of course, some of these ransomware attacks are state actors, so you're not allowed to technically be sending money to Iran or Russia anyway, where some of these ransomware attacks are launched from.
Yeah, it's complex, isn't it? And ransomware is kind of, it's just unbelievably annoying. It can really screw up your business quite easily. So we need to do something.
Well, I was going to say that the challenge for our members is ransomware is just one way that they can get attacked. Yeah. So another example is a member, their distributor in the US was hacked, and the hacker just waited, lurking around, waiting for the moment. And when I assume he or she saw the email that said, "Oh, this invoice is overdue, pay urgently so I can get delivery on a $500,000 piece of equipment," they intercepted the PDF invoice, changed the bank account details. So therefore the customer thought they paid, but our member did not get their money. Now that's not a ransomware attack, but it's far more devastating.
Yeah, that's an attack.
In a way.
Yeah, sure. Sure. I noticed in the report that there was a recommendation to establish the Cyber Incident Review Board. It said the report said major cyber incidents have potential to generate lessons that can be shared publicly to prevent future attack, what we've just been talking about. Businesses need to be informed of developing risks and require practical and easy-to-use information. And the CIRB can aid in this process, the Cyber Incident Review Board. The creating of a board like this, I guess, means that the policy team swoops into action and tries to figure out how we can best help government write something that will help business.
Yeah, so we've got mixed feelings about this board. We agree, lessons learned, always really useful, but is it going to be a public shaming exercise? Are we going to say, well, so-and-so didn't update, so-and-so didn't do the right staff training? Like, what are we learning here and how are we sharing it? And will it have an impact on insurance? So if we found that a company didn't do the most recent update in a timely manner, will their insurance be void? You know, what are the consequences? This is what we're always conscious of. We're trying to jump at shadows. What are the unintended consequences of this? And how much, so would this board have investigatory powers? Can they go into your systems, find out exactly what went wrong, or was it just a passive report? So all these things are really unclear. Agree there should be lessons learned, but we're not, if it's a genuine lessons learned environment, there should be no fault. And
there's the issue of I'm dealing with a massive attack and now all of a sudden the government's turned up saying, can you give me some information on what's going on? Yes, so that is one issue, because often the government, these regulations often say, well, if you've lost $1 million or if you've lost all your client data, you must report. But, feedback from members is that when you're in the middle of these attacks, it's a wave of discovery. So you know that someone's in there, something's wrong, but you don't know what they've got access to. You don't know what they've found, where they are. So it's not always clear that the printer example, they got into the printer. So would you report that? Because that's nothing yet. But you don't know, are they in the finance system? Are they in the customer system? All that kind of stuff. So as we found, I think from our survey work, these were the issues that came up for members, that they didn't know if they spent an extra $1 million, were they an extra $1 million safer? Who knew? Who knows? Like, it's really, there's so much uncertainty in this area. And particularly those mid-sized companies, they really, as I said, struggle because they've got something worth stealing, or they've got transactions that are worth intercepting, or they've got customer data, but they don't have the infrastructure to defend themselves. I find this issue fascinating because there's obviously major concern for every business person and individual, but every business person. And so, of course, the government's keen to have a look and see what they can do to make it better. And in the middle of that is exactly what we're talking about here on DBrief, that intersection between policy and industry and business. Let's keep talking about that. I find this fascinating. And so we've, to help members in the industry development side, so in addition to all this policy work we're doing, we've got a member reference group. And I think there should be a meeting in the next few weeks where we often have a member talk about if they've had an attack, so talk through their experience, and other members can share their best learnings. I think we're going to focus on staff training, the next one, and then we also give them an update on where the policy and legislation is going. Yeah, always remembering that the weakest link in all of this is staff. What we do every day when we open emails or whatever can affect this. Yeah. Let's move on. Another area of compliance and interest is the Modern Day Slavery Act. There's been some recent developments and changes, I think. Modern businesses source products and inputs from all around the world, and this causes shareholders, boards and governments to be concerned about what type of companies we're buying from. What's been happening? There's been a bit happening. By the way, the Red Cross report said that modern-day slavery differs from historical slavery in several ways. There are more slaves now than ever before, but they are a smaller proportion of the human race. No one seriously defends slavery anymore because slavery is illegal everywhere. But so all the slavery is corruption. It's all corruption. But now what we're going to do now is make sure that we're not dealing with these crimes, basically.
Yeah. So, the slavery is prevalent all around the world, even in the G20. Our top trading partners, China, US, Japan, Korea. So in China, estimated that 4 per 1,000 population would be considered as forced labour or slaves.
Right.
So it's quite extraordinary. In Australia, it's 1.6 per 1,000.
Yeah.
So
but it still exists.
It still exists.
Federal police say that in 23, forced marriage there was 90 reports, sexual servitude and exploitation 73 reports, forced labour 43, trafficking in persons 38, and exit trafficking, in other words, making it impossible for a person to leave, was 30. And that's only the ones that have been reported in terms of the federal police. It's much bigger than that. So it does exist in Australia.
Yeah.
We tend to think it doesn't.
Yeah.
But that's not the issue, is it? The issue is who we deal with globally, I think, is the problem, isn't it?
Well, that's right. It is looking at supply chains, and so it is a trade issue. So in Australia, we're actually probably more advanced than most other economies at the moment on how we're dealing with it. And primarily it's around putting obligations on companies to report every year on what they're doing to address slavery. So there have been some pretty big cases. There was a pretty big case with the AFP last year with this poor man was enslaved by a doctor who seemed to also own restaurants. Anyway, he worked every day, 14 hours a day, every day for 2 years, and was both promised visas and threatened reporting to immigration. It was a whole mess. Anyway, so I don't know, boss, would you say, but the slaver is in jail, and they're managing to recover this man's life and assisting him now. So that's a very individual example. What we deal with really is what companies need to do to comply with the new Modern Slavery Act 2018. So there's been some changes recently, including penalties for non-compliance with statutory reporting requirements. So if you don't report, not if you have slave, but if you don't report properly, there are fines. The threshold for reporting has been reduced from 100 million turnover to 50 million. And you need to report on modern slavery incidents and risks, and also have a due diligence system in place. As part of that,
if you have a turnover of $50 million a year, you have to report on modern day slavery. Okay.
Yeah. So it's quite extraordinary. So this is what's being proposed in the report. There will be a anti-slavery commissioner, but he or she won't have any enforcement powers or penalties and can't investigate, and will only have a $2 million budget. So I'm not sure what actually they can do with that. But the government has also created a modern slavery expert advisory group made up of industry representatives and human rights people and other interested parties. So I'm representing AI Group on that meeting group. We've had one meeting already, which was chaired by the Attorney General. He's very passionate about this. What was interesting to me was getting all the different stories from those who are on the front line of trying to deal with this. The conversation, as I said, the conversations they have, say, in Thailand are very different to the ones they would have in Melbourne. So making sure that they can adjust and adapt their engagement with their supply chain to make sure they're compliant. And we've got a meeting with members. We've got an anti-slavery member reference group where we talk about what we're learning from the advisory group and also get input from them to feed into the group. But the key thing that came from the group this last meeting was what the regulator is looking for from those reports. So if you get a penalty if you don't do the report, but how could you make sure that the report is impactful and is useful. And fundamentally, what they want to see is a plan for continuous improvement. So you can't just send a questionnaire to your suppliers and saying, do you have an anti-slavery policy? Get them to tick it, sign it, and send it back. That's just not going to cut it. You have to show that you're actually taking a risk-based approach. So, if we've already identified China, so if you've got suppliers in China, particularly in the Uyghur area, what are you doing to make sure that forced labour is not in your supply chain? So it's got to be proactive. It can't be just tick a box. And so we go through all those details with members in the member reference group, and then also give them an update on what the international developments are, because Canada has created its own, they call it Fighting Against Forced Labour and Child Labour in Supply Chains Act, and that was in force from the 1st of January this year. And so that reporting requirement applies pretty much to most Canadian businesses and government institutions. So in that case, you need 20 million in assets and at least 40 million in revenue, or employ at least 250 employees. So not that big, pretty mid-size. They're all going to be captured by this.
So two things from what you just said. If I'm a $5 million business and I'm supplying a $50 million business, they are likely to come ask me what I've done about risk management of modern-day slavery.
Yes.
Nothing. What? What do you want?
Well, so this is it. So if Woolworths or, Coles or, George Western Foods or BlueScope or whatever, they'll probably be running workshops. They might even ask us, to assist and get their suppliers to think.
Yeah, but you're saying to be much smaller than that. 50 million is not, we're dealing with businesses that are 50 million. That's that's a medium-sized. That's a medium-sized business. It's in fact the absolute medium of a medium-sized business, and so it's going to have a wide impact. The other thing that you mentioned was improving the impact of the report, and I've said before that years ago I worked in air freight, and the department would turn up every 6 months and say, "Tell me how many hazardous goods were loaded onto your planes this quarter, and how did you stop it?" And if we said none, they said no. That means you haven't done it properly. You certainly have had hazardous goods on your plane. You just haven't found them. Yeah. And so the pressure was on us. This is going to be the same sort of thing. If you say, "Yeah, there's no problem," people are going to say, "Well, hang on, I'm not sure that's true." If you're dealing with China, there must be some issues. It's going to be one to keep an eye on. So thank you. In more good news, let's talk about the Net Zero Carbon Emissions Act. This is all about decarbonisation, one of our Ds. AR Group delivered a submission to the Senate inquiry into the Net Zero Economy Authority Bill and the Net Zero Economy Authority Act 2024. And senior managers of AR Group have been in Canberra putting our views forward. My understanding is this. AR Group agrees with the establishment of the authority and of the bill itself, but we have some concerns around how it's going to be implemented. Couldn't talk to it for a little while?
Yeah, so this is a really good example where everyone nods sagely and agrees, yes, we need to get to net zero by 2050. And everyone agrees right up to the moment where something has to change in their lives. And this is an example where we're getting down into the nitty-gritty. So the purpose of this Net Zero Authority is to think about those communities who will suffer the most as we transition away from fossil fuels. So there's regional areas where we have coal-fired power stations, gas fields, etc. And there's a whole lot of infrastructure there. There's, schools, hospitals, people working. There's a whole lot of employment. So what do we do to help those communities find new industries and new opportunities without, creating ghost towns? And everyone thinks, yeah, of course, what a brilliant idea. Of course we need to do that. Mm-hmm. But in the detail of that is some of the rules and conditions around closing down a business. Now, those rules and conditions have been fought hard in workplace relations for a long time. And they've sort of got to a point, not where they agree, but at least they've stopped fighting, and they've reached a point where, okay, when a business shuts down, these are the benefits that former employees can have. And this is not our first transition, automotive, textile, when we opened up our economy, we had all these transitions. So this is well hard fought land. The challenge is that in this bill, those conditions have expanded quite extraordinarily. And our concern is that if we change those rules in this segment, just in, Morwell, for example, then thin edge of the wedge. All companies not related to net zero will be captured because this will soon become the standard. So it's not about fighting against the net zero. Everyone agrees it's the right thing, but we just want to make sure that we don't have, again, unintended consequences as we move towards this.
Also in this bill, there's the Transition Authority, is that what it's called? And AI Group's concern there is that the authority doesn't have much power. It's a bit like the Modern Day Slavery Commission. It doesn't seem to have much power. It's more about influence. Is it going to work?
Well, I mean, it's a big change. I mean, how are we going to change everything all at once? How are we going to stop all this coal-fired power stations? There's a whole lot of industry around there, not just those directly impacted by working, digging up the coal, transporting the coal and then working at the power station, but all the ancillary industries around it. I imagine it's circles upon circles. Yeah. So we need someone to be there watching, coordinating, putting their hand up saying, hey, you guys, when you shut this down, do you realise that, this guy's not going to get his steel, which means, his fabrication business is going to shut down, or which means 3 other businesses will shut down. Like, we need someone to be paying attention. As we learned during COVID, it's really hard for governments to understand the long tail of supply chains. You close one facility, you have no idea that it's going to impact, 10 or 20 other facilities. So that's what really I think this commissioner will have to do, is just try to monitor it, work with local communities, work with local governments to try to coordinate and make sure that we try to soften this transition.
There's a lot to it, isn't there? This is a briefing. It's meant to look at the issues, touch on them and explain them. You've done that very well in 3, I think. We'll put some things in the show notes for people who want to know more about each of those issues. Have you got some homework for this month?
Well, we said it's a year of the elections, and it is the Indian election has started. Keep an eye on the Indian election. We'll talk about that next time. One thing, though, is we've got a submission coming up on food manufacturing in Australia, okay. And I think that further to our conversation around.
Well, that's another great conversation, Louise. Thank you so much. Hey, before we go, last month you and I discussed the emerging concerning issue of the SAMS Act, Safeguarding Australian Military Secrets. The Act has now passed into law, and individuals and companies now have the new legal responsibilities. In my other AI Group podcast, Supply Circles, I recently interviewed commercial lawyer Rhiannon Willis about the issue. We had a great chat about her life and her career to date. It's an engaging conversation with an emerging leader. But then we unpack the SAMS Act and what it means for you. So we got Louise's perspective on the debrief last month, and for a different perspective on the issue, have a listen to Supply Circles. We'll put the link in the show notes, or you can request the link to the podcast by emailing us at industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. And if you are an AI Group member, there's an information pack and lots of detailed information available. Again, if you haven't received the information, drop us a line to industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. Louise, Rhiannon was a marvellous guest on Supply Circles. You're a strong supporter of emerging leaders, of the next generation of leaders. You'd enjoy it. You should have a listen.
No, I have listened to it. It's great.
Oh, good on you. Well, thank you, Louise. Always good to get your insight. It's fascinating. Next month, we're probably going to be talking about maybe the federal budget.
Yeah, definitely talking about federal budget and probably manufacturing, so that a food manufacturing submission, our latest report on manufacturing in Australia, I think will be next budget, big focus on manufacturing.
Good stuff. And just as a teaser, for anyone new to food manufacturing, Australia manufactures more than enough food to feed ourselves. And we have so much we can even export it. It's an interesting industry. Let's talk about it next month. All right. Well, that's it for the third episode of DBrief. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed the show, remember to like and subscribe, and please tell others about the show. I feel encouraged to view our post on LinkedIn. Go to my page or Louise's or Australian Industry Group, and please share the post about the show to your connections and networks. And as we always say, if you are as opinionated as we are, please give us feedback or send a question or comment to industry.policy@aigroup.com.au. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Louise. Let's talk next month.
Great. Thanks, James.